6 million years ago, something began happening to the Mediterranean Sea that should be impossible. The water started disappearing. Not because of a storm or a tsunami or anything that moved with the visible urgency of disaster. It disappeared slowly, the way a dream fades when you try to hold it, century by century, millennium by millennium, until one of the largest bodies of water on Earth had essentially ceased to exist. What was left behind was a basin deeper than almost anything on the planet's surface, a wound in the Earth so immense and so strange that standing at its edge, if you could have stood there, would have felt like looking down into a different world entirely. A world of cracked salt and unbearable heat, an air so dry that rain evaporated before reaching the ground. And then, after all of that, or after hundreds of thousands of years of absence, the water came back. Not slowly, all at once. That return is what makes this story almost impossible to fully absorb. The best available evidence suggests the Mediterranean may have refilled in a matter of weeks, possibly less. The volume of water that would have poured through the gap at Gibraltar in that event makes every flood in the entirety of recorded human history look like a leaking pipe. A wall of Atlantic Ocean crashing down into an almost empty basin, rising at rates that would have been visible in real time to any creature standing near the shore, which no creature capable of comprehending it was, because this happened 6 million years ago, when our ancestors were something small and uncertain in the forests of Africa, far from any coastline, with no words yet for what they were witnessing, even in the places they could reach. We know it happened because the Earth kept the evidence. It always does. It keeps evidence in salt formations 3 kilometers thick, buried beneath the modern seafloor. It keeps it in canyon systems carved into the bedrock by ancient rivers that suddenly found the sea had dropped away from them by more than a kilometer and spent thousands of years chasing that retreating surface downward, cutting gorges that make the Grand Canyon look modest. It keeps it in the layers of sediment drilled up from the deep basin, in the chemistry of ancient water preserved in crystals, in the microscopic shells of creatures that lived and died in conditions that shifted from a normal ocean to something closer to a dying brine lake, and back again within what is, by the timescales we are dealing with, a single breath. The Earth is a meticulous record keeper. The challenge is learning to read its language. The name scientists give to this event is the Messinian salinity crisis, named for Messina, the Sicilian city that sits at the narrow water between the island and the Italian mainland. 19th century geologists working in the rock formations near there found something that did not belong. Layers of gypsum and salt and other evaporate minerals sitting in sequences that only form under conditions of extreme concentration, conditions you associate with dying bodies of water, not with the floor of a functioning ocean. The geological age was named for the place, and the crisis that defines it carries that name still. To understand what happened, you need to start with something most people never think about when they look at the Mediterranean. It is not stable. It looks stable. It feels permanent the way old things feel permanent, but the entire system is balanced on a knife edge that has nothing to do with its depth or its size. The Mediterranean loses more water to evaporation each year than it receives from all its rivers and all its rainfall combined. That is not a minor imbalance. That is a structural deficit that would drain the sea in a geologically very short time if it were not constantly replenished. What keeps it alive is the Atlantic Ocean, which flows in steadily through the Strait of Gibraltar, topping up what the sun takes away. Close that gateway, even partially restrict it, and the countdown begins. 6 million years ago, that gateway was being closed. Not by any sudden event, but by the slow grinding of continents. Africa and Eurasia have been moving toward each other for tens of millions of years, a collision so gradual it measures itself in centimeters per year, building the Alps and raising the Pyrenees and reshaping every connection between the Atlantic and the ancestral sea that sat in the Mediterranean basin. By the late Miocene, the geological epoch we are talking about, that movement had narrowed the available corridors to the point where the entire system was becoming precarious. There were seaways then that no longer exist, routes through what is now southern Spain and northern Morocco that geologists call the Betic Corridor and the Riffian Corridor, broad marine passages that once let ocean water flow freely into the basin. One by one, as Africa continued pressing northward, they were closing. The coastlines of that world looked almost nothing like the ones we know. The Strait of Gibraltar, as we understand it today, did not yet exist in its current form. The familiar shape that you find on every map was still being assembled by forces that do not hurry. What existed instead was a lace of narrowing passages between basins, island-choked channels, low saddles between seas, a system that had been robust when it could afford to lose one gateway and lean on another, but was becoming brittle as the options were eliminated one by one. By the time the critical threshold was crossed, the Mediterranean was relying on a single narrow throat to maintain its connection to the world ocean. And that throat was being squeezed. The timing is still debated. Different reconstructions of the ancient geography place the closure of the final corridors at slightly different moments, anywhere from around 5.96 million years ago to somewhat earlier, depending on which evidence you weight most heavily. What the sediment records make clear is that something dramatic was happening in a specific window of time, and that the effects accumulated both before and after any single threshold. What also seems clear is that the late Miocene Mediterranean was already a sea under stress before the gateways fully closed. The climate was shifting toward cooler, drier conditions. Evaporation was intensifying. The rivers that fed the basin, the ancient Nile, the Proto-Rhone, the rivers draining the Alps and the Atlas Mountains, were contributing less relative to what the sun was pulling off the surface. The structural deficit was getting worse. The sea was not only losing its Atlantic supply, it was losing its fight with the sky. When evaporation outpaces replenishment in an enclosed body of water, something very specific and very patient begins to happen. Every water molecule that escapes the surface as vapor leaves behind whatever it was carrying in solution. The salt stays. The concentration rises. The next molecule that evaporates leaves behind slightly more salt per unit of remaining water. The process reinforces itself in the worst possible way, slowly but without any natural upper limit. Given enough time and a restricted enough inflow, a sea does not simply shrink, it transforms. It becomes something like the Dead Sea first, hypersaline, hostile to most life, thick and dense and still. Then, if conditions hold, it becomes stranger still. When salinity climbs high enough, minerals begin to precipitate directly out of the water. Calcium carbonate comes first, then gypsum, then halite, which is ordinary rock salt, then more exotic compounds as the chemistry pushes into ranges that have no analogue in a normal ocean. These minerals sink to the seafloor in layers, and the layers accumulate, and over thousands of years of concentrated dyeing they can reach extraordinary thicknesses. Geologists call these deposits evaporites, and when they accumulate across vast areas, they call them salt giants. The Mediterranean salt giant is one of the largest ever identified on this planet. Roughly 1 million cubic kilometers of evaporate material is buried beneath the modern seafloor. A record written in mineral chemistry of what happens when an inland sea is sealed off and left to cook in the sun. 1 million cubic kilometers of salt. That number resists imagination. Salt that was once dissolved in an ocean, pulled out of solution by evaporation, leaving behind a geological monument to absence. The sheer volume of it is not just impressive, it is a clue, almost accusatory in its implications, pointing back toward an event of enormous duration and severity. But the salt alone does not tell the full story. In the sediment cores drilled from beneath the seafloor and in the cliff faces where ancient Miocene rocks are exposed on land, geologists see stacked sequences that reveal a more complicated rhythm than a single long slide into desiccation. A thin layer of fine mud, sometimes with traces of normal marine life, or above it, a thicker layer of gypsum crystals, sometimes growing in delicate blade-like forms. Above that, halite, massive or laid out in rhythmic couplets. Then again, mud. Again gypsum. Again salt. Flooding, concentration, drying, reset. The repetition is the important part. A single thick blanket of salt could theoretically be explained by one long stable hypersaline phase. But when you see packages of evaporates separated by thin returns to more normal sediment, it suggests something else. A basin breathing in and out in shallow, increasingly desperate cycles, sometimes receiving a pulse of Atlantic water that temporarily refreshed the brine before the restriction tightened again. Sometimes filling briefly with lake water from rivers building shallow basins on the exposed floor before the sun stripped them away. The crisis was probably not a single smooth slide from normalcy to salt flat. It was more likely a complicated oscillation, each cycle bringing the system a little closer to the edge. Under the microscope, the gypsum layers resolve into tiny laminae, light and dark, each couplet potentially marking a seasonal shift. A wet season when a little more water could dilute the brine. A dry season when the surface dropped and crystals grew faster. You are looking at years, centuries, even millennia of slow, painful oscillation encoded in bands a millimeter thick, and the tiny fossils locked in those layers tell a different part of the same story. Most marine sediments are full of foraminifera, tiny shelled organisms that float in the water column or live on the seafloor, and coccolithophores, algae that build intricate plates of calcite. Their shells rain down continuously, building carpets of microscopic skeletons that carry a record of temperature and salinity and depth. During the Messinian, that quiet snow of skeletons changes abruptly. Species that prefer well-oxygenated water of moderate salinity and stable depth disappear first. Others hang on a little longer. Eventually, in the heart of the evaporate sequences, the microfossils almost vanish, replaced only by forms that can tolerate extreme conditions, or by biological silence that corresponds to periods when salinity may have exceeded the tolerance of most marine life entirely. And then, above the crisis horizon, they return. Open ocean species. Normal marine plankton. Chemistry that matches a well-connected, well-oxygenated basin. The transition, in many cores, looks almost like flipping a switch. Or it is worth staying with the biological picture for a moment, because what the microfossils describe is not simply a list of species that disappeared and returned. It is a record of an ecosystem unraveling in stages, which is the way all large-scale ecological collapse actually happens. The Mediterranean did not go from a functioning ocean to a salt flat in a single transition. It went through intermediate states, each one more stressed than the last, each one filtering out another layer of biological complexity until what remained was the hardiest core, the organisms that had evolved to tolerate the unstable, the brackish, the periodically lethal, and those survivors, whatever their exact identities, are the ancestors of the creatures that repopulated the basin when the Atlantic returned. The biological legacy of the Messinian crisis is threaded through the genetics of every organism that lives in the Mediterranean today, carrying the evolutionary signature of a time when this sea was something that tested life to its limits, and only some of it endured. The climate effects of the crisis extended far beyond the basin itself. A wide, warm body of water performs services for the surrounding land that are easy to overlook until they are withdrawn. It moderates temperature extremes, prevents the kinds of killing frosts that would otherwise arrive in winter, limits the intensity of summer heat by providing a thermal buffer that the land alone cannot provide. It feeds moisture into the atmosphere that becomes rain on the mountains and the coastal ranges, the rain that in turn feeds the rivers, which in turn feed the sea. Remove that buffer or reduce it to scattered hypersaline lakes sitting far below their natural level, and the feedback loops that kept the surrounding lands habitable change character entirely. The late Miocene world around the Mediterranean basin would have become progressively drier and more extreme as the crisis deepened, with the changes radiating outward in ways that affected plants and animals that never touched the water itself. Alongside the chemical and biological evidence, the rocks around the edges of the ancient basin preserve something more physical and more immediate. Rivers pay very close attention to where the sea is. In geomorphology, there is a concept called base level, the lowest point a river can erode down to, which under normal circumstances is sea level. Seekai, change that level, and the river's entire behavior changes with it. Lower the base level and rivers sharpen. They cut downward. They stop meandering and start digging, racing to reach the new lower outlet. If the Mediterranean surface was dropping, the rivers feeding it would have responded with the geological equivalent of alarm. And that is exactly what the evidence suggests happened. Beneath the sediments of the Nile Delta, buried under layers of younger deposits and drowned under the modern seafloor, there is another Nile, a ghost river. Seismic surveys and deep drilling have revealed that during the Messinian, the Nile carved a valley far deeper than anything the modern river requires. Its buried canyon cuts down hundreds of meters below present sea level, slicing through older strata on the continental shelf and continuing basinward toward what would at the time have been exposed Mediterranean floor. To drive a river that deep, something has to pull its base level down with it. You cannot get that kind of incision while the downstream end is sitting comfortably near present sea level. And the Nile was not alone. In southern France, the Rhône tells a similar story. Under its delta, seismic profiles reveal a steep V-shaped valley cut into older Miocene sediments, later backfilled when the sea returned. Around the Iberian Peninsula, other rivers feeding into the western Mediterranean preserve signs of what geologists call over-deepening during the Messinian. The pattern repeats along different margins at different scales. Rivers cutting too far, too fast, in ways that cannot be explained by ordinary conditions. It is as if all around the rim of the basin, every river simultaneously got permission to fall. Picture it from inside. The early Nile confronted with a Mediterranean whose surface has sagged hundreds of meters below its old shoreline. The last stretch of the river, which used to meet the sea in a broad estuary, is suddenly hanging in the air above a distant, deepening basin. The gravitational potential energy of that water, its desire to fall, is no longer balanced by a nearby sea. So the river starts carving headward, working its way upstream through its own bedrock and sediments, lowering itself to match the new base level far below. Waterfalls form. Steep nick points migrate inland as slabs of rock collapse. Over thousands of years, this process can sculpt canyons of extraordinary scale. Several Mediterranean rivers appear to have done exactly this, not because the land rose so dramatically, but because the sea they flowed into fell. And those canyons, those enormous Messinian incisions, were not simply abandoned when the sea returned. They were drowned. They became the submarine canyons and continental slopes that modern ships cross without ever seeing, the ghosts of an absence buried beneath the ordinary business of a functioning ocean. At its extreme, in some reconstructions, the Mediterranean during the height of the crisis was not a single body of water at all, but a patchwork of separate subbasins partly filled with brine lakes at different levels, each shrinking and refilling on its own schedule. Between them, nice long slopes of exposed continental margin descend towards salt-encrusted flats and isolated pools of thick, oily brine. The air above this landscape would have been ferocious. A wide, warm body of water is an engine for humidity, moderating the temperatures of surrounding lands, feeding clouds, softening frosts. Remove it or shrink it to small hot lakes far below their natural level, and the surrounding lands begin to dry. Winds crossing the exposed basin floor would pick up dust and salt rather than moisture. The effect on regional climate would have cascaded outward, drying the margins, altering where rain fell, changing what grew and what died across a vast swath of the ancient world. Life within the basin retreated to corners. There is a word biologists use for this, refugia, the pockets where conditions remain just good enough for survival. In a drawn-down Mediterranean, refugia might have formed at depth, in places where the remaining water was insulated from the worst surface evaporation by density stratification, where cold-adapted species could endure in dim, hushed water long after their relatives on shallower margins had given up. Or at the margins, in lagoons where river water and groundwater could dilute the salt, brackish lakes clinging to the feet of retreating cliffs, unstable but offering windows of survival to the hardy and flexible. Along the shorelines of whatever brine pools persisted, microbial mats might have laid down thin, rubbery carpets under a glaring sun, bacteria and algae turning the fluctuating chemistry into slow layered films of life. This was not a lifeless void. It was a world of edges, of organisms pushed to the limits of their tolerance and finding, in some cases, that the limits were further than expected. All of this, the salt giants, the ghost canyons, the fossil refugia, the collapsed ecosystems, was the setup for what came next. Everything had been arranged by hundreds of thousands of years of geological patience. The basin had emptied, the margins had reorganized, the ecosystems had retreated to their corners, and somewhere to the west, the Atlantic Ocean was still there, enormous and full and pressing against the barrier that had been slowly rising between them. The Strait of Gibraltar region during the Messinian was not a fixed gap. It was a geologically restless hinge, its sill, the shallowest point of the passage, rising and falling as blocks of crust crumpled and adjusted and as sediment washed in from nearby rivers. Small changes in this threshold had enormous consequences. Make the sill a little shallower, and you restrict the exchange between ocean and basin. The surface inflow weakens, the deep outflow thins, evaporation keeps pulling, but now the pathway for compensation is cramped. Push things further, raise the sill more, and you edge toward thresholds where the physics of water exchange rearrange themselves entirely. A system that had once maintained a clean two-layer exchange, Atlantic water flowing in at the surface and denser Mediterranean water spilling back out at depth, could under the right geometry deteriorate into something messier, intermittent, unreliable, increasingly tipped toward closure. What finally pushes such a system over the edge is rarely a single dramatic gesture. It is the accumulation of many quiet shifts, millimeters of uplift each year at a critical sill, centimeters of sediment added by each flood season, variations in global sea level riding the rhythm of ice ages, raising and lowering the base level against which all these channels are cut. The Messinian Mediterranean may have been living in a state of suppressed motion, its internal physics primed for exchange, its surroundings conspiring to prevent it. And the more the sea evaporated and became salty, the denser its waters became, and in principle, the more eagerly they wanted to flow back out into the Atlantic. But if the gateway had become too shallow, too narrow, too roughened by sediment and tectonic scars, that eagerness was trapped. Density wanted to drive circulation. Topography refused. Then, near the end of the Messinian, roughly 5.33 million years ago, something in that western hinge shifted. Perhaps tectonic subsidence lowered part of the sill. Perhaps erosion, working quietly through a narrow, still wet channel, finally deepened a critical point. Perhaps global sea level rose just enough to let the Atlantic lean harder against a weakened barrier. Whatever the exact combination, the effect was the same. A configuration that had been holding the gate closed crossed a threshold and became a configuration that could not. The Atlantic found a path. The first trickle crept over the sill and began to descend the far side. And once that happened, physics took over in a way that has no gentle version. Water flowing downhill accelerates. As it accelerates, gains the power to move sediment and abrade rock. The faster it moves, the more effectively it cuts. Cut a little deeper into the sill, and you lower the spillway. Lower the spillway, and the height difference between the Atlantic and the empty basin increases. More height means more potential energy. More potential energy means faster flow. Faster flow means more erosion. More erosion deepens the channel. This is what geomorphologists call positive feedback. a self-amplifying cycle where a small change grows into something that cannot be stopped until a new equilibrium is reached. A narrow, shallow breach can sharpen into a canyon. A modest waterfall can become a plunging cataract. A localized leak, under the right geometry, can reorganize into a runaway drainage event on a scale that has no modern comparison. This event has a name. Scientists call it the Zanclean Flood, named for the earlier stage of the Pliocene that began when the Mediterranean was restored to a connected sea. The scale of what some models suggest happened during that reconnection is difficult to hold in the mind, but the attempt is worth making. The Atlantic and the deep parts of the desiccated Mediterranean may have differed in elevation by more than a kilometer. In some reconstructions, the Atlantic shoreline stood hundreds of meters above even the highest surviving Messinian lake surfaces, a wall of potential energy locked up in the difference between a full ocean and an almost empty basin, held back by geology and finally released by the same slow forces that had created the crisis in the first place. Once the Atlantic found continuous passage across the sill, the gorge at Gibraltar would have deepened and widened with terrifying efficiency. Waterfalls, hundreds of meters high, cascading into a spreading lake. A jet of incoming flow, scouring a trench that raced east across the floor of the Alboran Sea, and then deeper into the main Mediterranean basin. Depending on the height difference, the resistance of the rocks, and the details of what exactly existed on the far side, estimates for how long it took to refill the Mediterranean range from a few months in the most extreme models to decades or perhaps centuries in more conservative ones. Either end of that range is extraordinary. A few months to refill a basin the size of the Mediterranean would require flows on the order of tens of millions of cubic meters per second, comparable to or exceeding the largest glacial outburst floods ever reconstructed from the geological record. Even the calmer versions, stretched to decades, would still involve flows that make the Amazon at flood stage look modest. Consider the Missoula floods for context, the catastrophic releases of glacial meltwater that carved the channeled scablands of the Pacific Northwest of the United States near the end of the last ice age. Those events are among the most thoroughly documented large-scale floods in Earth's recent geological history, with peak discharges estimated at perhaps 10 million cubic meters per second, enough to strip hundreds of meters of rock and soil and deposit fields of giant ripples tall as houses. Those floods were enormous by any standard, and they lasted days to weeks at a time. Some Zanclean flood models suggest similar or larger discharges, sustained not from a glacial lake, but from the open Atlantic, with a virtually unlimited supply of water and a basin with kilometers of vertical relief to fill. At peak discharge, the rising water in the deepest parts of the basin might have climbed tens of meters per day. Shorelines racing upslope faster than a person could walk. The canyons that the Messinian rivers had spent thousands of years carving, those enormous over-deepened gorges, would have become pathways, channels already cut to receive the incoming flood, funneling Atlantic water deep into the basin and distributing it across the salt flats and the remnant brine lakes with a speed that the landscape had no time to adjust to. The Nile Canyon, hundreds of meters deep and stretching far out onto what had been the continental shelf, would have become an inlet, then a bay, then a drowned valley as the water climbed the walls. Every shoreline feature carved by the long, slow decline of the Messinian, every wave-cut terrace and abandoned beach and cliff face would have been overwhelmed and submerged within whatever timescale the flood operated on. The evidence for this transition is written with unusual clarity in the sediment record. On one side of the Messinian-Zanclean boundary in the cores, you see the fingerprints of a dying basin, thick salt layers disturbed by slumps and collapse, signs of extreme concentration and fluctuating water levels, micro-fossil assemblages dominated by forms that tolerate hypersaline and shallow water conditions, or replaced by biological silence. On the other side, separated by a boundary that looks in many records remarkably sharp, you see the return of open ocean conditions. Normal marine planktonic organisms characteristic of a well-connected, oxygenated basin, chemistry consistent with Atlantic-influenced water, sediments that look exactly like what you would expect in a normal deep-sea environment. The transition between these two states happens over what appears in many cores to be a very thin interval, too thin to comfortably accommodate tens of thousands of years of gradual change, thin enough to be consistent with an event operating on timescales of years to decades rather than millennia. There is genuine debate about precisely how to read this boundary, about whether the Zanclean flood was a single catastrophic event or a sequence of pulses with quieter intervals between them, about how empty the basin really was just before the reconnection, about whether the deepest central depressions stood fully exposed as dry land or hosted residual deep brine bodies throughout the crisis. These are live questions in the scientific literature, and the uncertainty is real and worth naming directly. What almost everyone agrees on is that the rocks record a Mediterranean that was pushed far outside its normal operating range, that the transition back to normal marine conditions happened rapidly on geological timescales, and that the mechanism involved substantial erosion and restructuring of the seafloor at the Western Gateway. Whether the flood took weeks or decades, it was a threshold event, not a gradual slide, a system balanced between two stable states that flipped from one to the other when the Western Gateway crossed a critical depth. And what came after was the long, slow process of a sea finding its new equilibrium. Those great Messinian canyons carved by rivers chasing a disappearing sea were now pathways for the incoming Atlantic water to reach the deep basin. As the Mediterranean rose, their lower reaches drowned first, turning into long, narrow inlets. As the water kept climbing, the flooded sections crept upstream, bend after bend, until what had been a river valley became an estuary, then a bay, then a gently widening shelf. The deepest reaches, with their steep walls and hanging tributaries, never had the chance to fill with sediment in an orderly way. They were instantly converted into submarine canyons, extensions of ancient rivers now hidden beneath hundreds of meters of seawater. You can still see them today if you look at the right maps. Great gouges cutting into the continental margins, pointing like arrows toward the deep basin, the ghosts of Messinian incisions modified but not erased by the Zanclean flood and everything that followed. On shore, the story was different. River mouths that had once been stranded far from the coast found the sea pressing in on them. Deltas that had marched out across exposed continental shelves during the low stand were drowned, their tops planed off by waves, their channels reworked into new patterns. The Nile Delta, which today flares out into the southeastern Mediterranean like a green fan, would have had to start entirely over, building new distributaries and new wetlands on top of whatever distorted landscape the crisis had left behind. The sediment pathways that had reorganized so dramatically during the Messinian, funneling material directly into the deep basin along steep gullies, returned to the slower and more orderly pattern of the present. Rivers dropping their loads on broad coastal plains and shallow shelves, submarine canyons funneling occasional storm-driven turbidity currents down into the abyss, the whole system breathing gently with the seasons instead of racing frantically toward a retreating base level. The restored Mediterranean was not identical to its predecessor. The salt that had been deposited during the Messinian did not dissolve and disappear when the Atlantic came back. It was entombed. Each new season of marine sediment added another thin layer on top of it. Over millions of years, those layers accumulated into a thick, muffling blanket of Pliocene and Quaternary clays and silts and sands. Today, those Messinian salts lie buried beneath hundreds to thousands of meters of younger rock, deforming under their own weight, flowing slowly like cold honey, creating strange domes and ridges in the subsurface that only reveal themselves in seismic profiles and drilling reports. The surface of the sea, though, gave little hint of that buried history. Blue and calm and moderating the climates of every coastline it touched, the restored Mediterranean began performing again the function it performs today, absorbing heat in summer and releasing it in winter, evaporating moisture that feeds the clouds that water the olive trees and the vineyards and the forests of the surrounding lands. The re-flooding also set in motion the repopulation of the basin by life. During the salinity crisis, Marine organisms had either retreated to refugia or been lost entirely from the Mediterranean. Once the Zanclean flood reopened a broad, deep connection, the sea became again a colonization target. Planktonic organisms whose larvae drift with currents were among the first to arrive, carried by the incoming surface flow from the Atlantic. Their remains give many early Pliocene sediments in the region their distinctive microfossil signature, a sudden appearance of open ocean species, where before there had been brine-tolerant specialists or biological silence. Following them came the larger creatures, the fish expanding their ranges into the new basin, invertebrates spreading along the shelves, benthic communities colonizing the soft muds that began to accumulate on the abyssal plains, corals and sponges finding purchase on the rocky walls of the drowned canyon systems. In a geological blink, the Mediterranean went from a stressed and partially desiccated marginal basin to a thriving and reasonably well-connected arm of the global ocean. The lessons written into this sequence of events extend well beyond the specific history of one sea. The Messinian story is in some ways a demonstration of how planetary systems behave when they approach thresholds, which is to say in ways that bear very little resemblance to how they behave when they are comfortably away from them. For millions of years before the crisis, the Mediterranean had looked completely stable. Water flowed in and out, sediment settled, life adapted to a fairly consistent range of conditions. If you could walk along its shores in the early late Miocene, nothing would have told you that this sea was in any sense fragile. The basin was deep. The coasts were familiar. Tides rose and fell. Storms came and went. But beneath that apparent stability, a few critical parameters were slowly drifting. Africa was pushing north, narrowing the seaways. The climate was tilting toward dryness. Tectonics were lifting some sills, depositing sediment in channels, gradually reducing the effective cross-section through which water could exchange between ocean and basin. Each of these changes was small by human standards, vast over a human lifetime, but modest on geological scales. For a very long time, they did not seem to matter. Then, past a certain combination, they did. The comfortable operating range of the system ended, and what replaced it was something entirely different. Enclosed basins depend on narrow gateways far more than they appear to. You can have millions of cubic kilometers of water and still be hostage to a strait only a few dozen kilometers wide and a few hundred meters deep. Close that gateway, just enough, under the right climate and at the right stage of tectonic development, and you transform an oceanic sea into something more like a gigantic dying lake. And the fragility cuts in both directions. The same sensitivity that allowed slow geological changes to push the Mediterranean into crisis also allowed the crisis to end abruptly when the configuration of the gateway crossed a different threshold. A system that drifts slowly toward one extreme can flip explosively back toward the other when conditions change. The patience of the approach and the violence of the return are both consequences of the same underlying physics. There is also something to be said about scale. The Messinian crisis and the Zanclean flood together represent a rearrangement of one of the major ocean basins of this planet, accomplished not by any dramatic external event, no meteor, no supervolcano, no sudden shift in the Earth's orbit, but by the ordinary operation of tectonics and climate working together over millions of years to push a system past its balance point. The rivers of an entire region reorganized their behavior. The climate of southern Europe and North Africa shifted. The global ocean felt the effects as vast quantities of salt were locked into evaporate deposits in a closed basin, then released back into circulation when the connection was restored. These were not local events in any meaningful sense. The Mediterranean crisis was a planetary-scale rearrangement caused by relatively modest changes in the geography of a passage a few dozen kilometers wide. Understanding this requires accepting something that does not come naturally to minds evolved to track threats on the timescale of a single life. The most consequential changes are often invisible until they are not. A sill rises by millimeters per year. A channel fills with sediment by centimeters per decade. A climate shifts by fractions of a degree per century. None of these changes, taken individually, announces itself as significant. But they are cumulative, and cumulative processes can cross thresholds, and thresholds, once crossed, reorganize the world on the far side of them in ways that the world on the near side would not have predicted. The evidence for all of this was not obvious. When the first seismic surveys revealed an anomalously reflective layer extending across vast areas of the deep Mediterranean basin in the mid-20th century, the interpretation was not immediately clear. Something was down there, thick and continuous, but what it was required drilling to determine. When cores came up with kilometers of gypsum and halite, when the microfossil record showed the catastrophic shift from marine to hypersaline conditions, when the buried canyons of the Nile and the Rhone were traced through seismic profiles to their improbable depths, the picture began assembling itself into something that initially seemed impossible, and eventually came to seem almost inevitable, because all the pieces fit together so cleanly. The salt said something catastrophic happened. The canyons said the sea level dropped dramatically. The microfossil record said the marine ecosystems collapsed and then recovered abruptly. The boundary between Messinian and Zanclean sediments said the recovery happened fast. Put them all together, and you get a story that the Earth had been keeping, quietly and completely, in the rock below the waves. The investigation is not finished. New seismic surveys using higher resolution techniques continue to refine the shapes of the subsurface structures. New cores drilled in places that older expeditions never reached reveal unexpected details, or laminated deep basin gypsum where only muds were anticipated, chaotic breccias that hint at sudden collapses during extreme low stands. There is something worth saying about how this knowledge was assembled, because the process itself is remarkable. The evidence for the Messinian crisis is entirely indirect. There were no human observers. There are no written records. Everything we know comes from sound waves sent through rock, from slender cylinders of sediment extracted from beneath kilometers of water, from the chemistry of crystals and the shapes of microscopic shells, and the geometry of buried valleys traced through acoustic profiles of the seafloor. The geologists who first proposed that the Mediterranean had nearly dried out were met with substantial skepticism. A normal sea was not supposed to do that. The proposal seemed extreme, almost fantastical, the kind of claim that requires extraordinary evidence. And the evidence came, piece by piece, over decades of drilling and seismic surveying and careful analysis, each new result slotting into the framework and confirming that however strange the story sounded, the rocks were telling it clearly. That is how large scientific revisions happen, not in a single moment of revelation, but in the slow accumulation of data from many directions, each piece independently pointing toward the same conclusion until the weight of it becomes impossible to dismiss. Whether the sill failed catastrophically in a single pulse, or in a series of surges separated by quieter intervals. Whether the deep basin was truly exposed subaerially, or whether pockets of dense brine persisted in some depressions throughout the crisis. How the global ocean registered the locking away and sudden release of so much salt. These are not settled questions. They are active debates, sharpened by new data and better models, playing out in the scientific literature, with the slightly heightened urgency that comes from knowing that each new piece of evidence has the potential to reorganize a picture that looked nearly complete. That the story is not finished is appropriate. The Mediterranean crisis unfolded over hundreds of thousands of years, and a certain patience is required to untangle it. The Earth took that long to push the system past its threshold, and it keeps its records with the same geological thoroughness. Somewhere beneath the quiet waves, in layers not yet drilled, in structures not yet imaged at the right resolution, the next hints are waiting. A different kind of evaporate, a subtly shifted microfossil assemblage, a buried canyon filled with unexpected sediments. The investigation continues by the same methods that uncovered what we already know. Sound waves sent into the rock and listened to for their echoes. Slender cylinders of sediment pulled up from beneath the seafloor and read, layer by layer, outcrops on land examined with the forensic attention of people who know that every mineral and every fossil is a letter in a message sent from 6 million years ago. The Mediterranean is full now. Its waves lap against beaches lined with cities. Ferries cross its straits. Fishing boats rock in harbours that have been fishing in this same water for thousands of years of recorded human history, and for tens of thousands before that. To stand on its shore is to feel a sense of permanence, the particular quality of something ancient and reliable that has always been there and will always be there. That feeling is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete. Under those calm waves lies a record of a time when the sense of permanence was entirely wrong, when a sea that looked just as permanent as this one looked today was in fact quietly dying, century by century, until it was gone. And then, after all that absence, after all that salt and heat and exposed bedrock and retreating shorelines and rivers cutting canyons into the exposed margin, the Atlantic found a gap in the geology, and everything changed in what may have been weeks. The sea returned. The way it returned was violent beyond any modern comparison and brief beyond the resolution of most geological tools. And then it settled, and it calmed, and it became again something that could be called ordinary, something that creatures could live beside and in and from for millions of years. Something that human beings would eventually come to see as eternal, not knowing what was underneath, not knowing what the rocks below the seafloor remembered, not knowing that the calm blue surface stretched above a perfect archive of catastrophe that would require centuries of scientific effort to even partially read. It is there tonight, under whatever darkness lies outside. The same water, still evaporating, still being replaced through the same narrow gateway, still balanced on the same knife edge that the slow movement of continents and the patient accumulation of climate change tipped so dramatically 6 million years ago. The balance is stable now in the way it was stable then, which is to say, contingent, dependent on a passage a few dozen kilometers wide and a few hundred meters deep, and on the forces that continue to work on it with the same millimeter-per-year patience they have always had. The sea holds its memory in salt and buried canyons, and the abrupt boundary in its sediments between a dying basin and a restored one. It holds that memory without announcement, without drama, in the ordinary silence of rock beneath water. The waves move. The depths are still. Whatever is down there is not finished telling its story. It is simply waiting for the next question.